You have looked at your bank account. You have counted what is there, measured what arrives each month, and searched the visible world for some opening, some resource, some material from which something greater could be built. And you have found the numbers flat, the salary unchanged, the opportunities narrow. Everything you can see tells you that there is not enough here to begin with, not enough to grow from, not enough to move. From where you stand, looking only at what is visible, the conclusion feels rational. There is no material from which wealth can rise. This is the belief that governs most people without their ever questioning it. Money must come from money. Opportunity must emerge from existing opportunity. Wealth must be constructed from the visible resources already in hand. If you have little, you can build little. If you have nothing, you can build nothing. It is a belief that presents itself as common sense, as sober realism, as the responsible way to see the world. And because it sounds reasonable, it is almost never examined. It is simply accepted, and the accepted thing becomes the prison. Wallace Wattles, writing in the early 20th century, taught something that disrupts this prison entirely. Behind every visible thing, he said, there is a formless, living substance from which all created things are drawn. Visible wealth, the money, the business, the property, the abundance, is not the beginning of the process. It is a late stage. Before visible wealth can appear in any human life, something invisible must be impressed. Something unseen must be set in motion. The visible is always an effect. The cause lives in a dimension most people never learn to touch. This video reveals that secret. It reveals the nature of the living invisible substance that Wattles described, the mechanism by which thought impresses it, and the invisible power that creates all wealth before wealth ever becomes visible. There is a question worth sitting with before we go further. You may have been working very hard to attract money, to command better circumstances, to think positively about what you want. But there is a difference between commanding money and commanding the substance from which money comes. The question is whether you have been reaching for the effect while ignoring the cause entirely. There is a kind of mental ritual that happens daily for millions of people. They open a banking application before they have finished their first cup of coffee. They add up what is in the account, subtract what is owed, and measure the distance between where they are and where they want to be. The distance is almost always the same. It does not shrink the way they wish it would, and so the morning begins already haunted by the arithmetic of limitation. Then comes the looking for chances, the scan of job postings, the scroll through opportunities, the quiet watching for something that could become a door. And the visible world answers the same way it always does, with narrow openings, with requirements that seem designed to exclude, with the sense that every channel that could carry wealth seems to be already occupied by someone else who arrived earlier. The feeling is not merely frustration, it is a slow, creeping certainty that the timing has passed. The belief underneath the frustration is that they are late, that the people who built wealth had some first mover advantage, some initial capital, some connection or talent or circumstance that arrived before theirs. And because that early resource is not present now, the window has closed. This feeling of lateness is one of the most quietly devastating things a person can carry, because it converts every present moment into evidence of permanent disadvantage. What this produces, practically, is a mind that will not begin anything large. It will not hold a definite vision of wealth, because the visible numbers make that vision seem dishonest. It will not move with creative boldness, because it has accepted that creative boldness requires visible material it does not possess. The ordinary mistake is not laziness, and it is not failure of will. It is the fundamental confusion between the effect and the cause, between the visible result and the invisible creative origin from which all visible results are drawn. When the belief is that visible material is the only creative medium, the methods that follow become predictable. The person begins to compete, not in an obvious way, not necessarily with aggression, but in the deep structural sense that Wattles identified. They see wealth as something distributed among a fixed number of positions, and they strain to reach one of those positions before someone else claims it. Competition of this kind is not a strategy, it is a philosophy, and it shapes everything. It forces money from narrow channels. The mind fixes itself on a single path, a promotion, a specific client, a particular investment, and pushes against that path with mounting anxiety. When that path does not yield, the anxiety increases and the pushing intensifies. The channel narrows further under pressure. What began as effort becomes compulsion, and compulsion produces diminishing returns. Then comes the copying, the watching of what other people have done that seemed to work, and the attempt to replicate it. This person moved into that market. That person built their wealth through this method. The copying is not learning. It is a form of borrowing someone else's channel without any relation to the substance that filled it. The result is a hollow imitation of a pattern that worked for someone else in conditions that no longer exist, built on a foundation of invisible causation that the copier has never recognized or touched. Beneath all of this is a single governing assumption. The visible world is the only material, the only clay, the only field from which anything can grow. If that field looks barren, the conclusion is that nothing can grow. The false method is built entirely on this assumption, and it cannot produce creative wealth because it has excluded the only medium through which creative wealth actually originates. The cost of material-only thinking is not simply that it produces less visible money. The deeper cost is what it does to the mind itself. A mind that believes only in visible resources becomes structurally competitive. It cannot hold generous vision because it is always measuring how much of the fixed supply is available. Generosity in such a mind feels like arithmetic loss. Creative expansion feels like wishful thinking. The mind becomes a mechanism for survival, not a mechanism for creation. Desire shrinks under this pressure, not immediately but gradually. The person learns through repeated frustration to want less. They pare down the image of what is possible until it matches what the visible evidence seems to permit. This feels like maturity. It is called being realistic. But what has actually happened is that the desire, which in Wattles' framework is the formative impulse that impresses the living substance, has been slowly dissolved by the corrosive belief that visible scarcity is the final word. Something else disappears alongside desire. The person loses what Wattles would call creative relation, the living, responsive, connected orientation toward the formless supply. Creative relation is not a feeling or a mood. It is a specific inner position, the recognition that wealth is drawn from a source that does not run out, that the medium of creation is always abundant, and that the mind's function is to impress that medium with definite form. Without that recognition, the person has no relation to the source. They are trying to build something while standing entirely outside the creative field. What cannot be commanded is what is not acknowledged. This is the hidden cost in its most precise form. The invisible substance, which Wattles described as living, responsive, and permeated by desire for expression, cannot be commanded by a mind that denies its existence. The person who believes only in visible material is not merely uninformed. They are actively, continuously blocking their own creative power by directing their entire attention to the effect and refusing to look at the cause. The invisible power remains untouched, unused, and silent, not because it is absent, but because it has never been addressed. Consider the logic of visible wealth for a moment. Every building you have ever entered was once a thought. The desk at which someone works, the company that employs them, the currency in which they are paid, each of these passed through invisible stages before it arrived in visible form. Not metaphorically, literally. There was a time when these things existed only as definite intention in a human mind, before any physical material had been assembled, before any visible channel had been opened. If visible wealth is always an effect, then the cause must precede it. The cause must be prior in time and prior in nature. Something invisible must move first. This is not mysticism invented to comfort the poor. It is the structural sequence that every created thing has followed. The question Wattles forces is simply this. If you want to produce visible wealth, where do you actually begin? Do you begin with the visible resources you already have, which are the effects of prior causes? Or do you go behind them to the cause itself? The invisible substance that Wattles describes is that cause. It is the creative field into which definite thought is cast, from which forms emerge, through which channels open, and through which visible wealth arrives in human life. It is not abstract in the sense of being untouchable. It is abstract in the sense that it precedes physical form. To work with it is to work at the level of origin, not the level of effect. The section ahead describes this law in its full precision. It names the substance, explains the mechanism of impression, and shows exactly how invisible causation produces visible wealth. If you have been working hard at visible results while the invisible cause has remained untouched, what follows will feel less like new information and more like the rule you have always been playing against without knowing its name. Wattles opens his teaching with a declaration that is easy to read and almost impossible to fully absorb on first encounter. There is a formless substance, he wrote, from which all things are made. This substance fills the interspaces of the universe and permeates all things. A thought held within this substance produces the thing that is imagined. This is not poetry. In Wattles' framework, it is the foundational law of wealth creation, the most basic fact about how visible things come into existence. The substance is described as formless, meaning it has no fixed shape, no inherent limitation, no boundary that prevents it from becoming anything. It is the invisible raw material behind all physical matter. Thought gives it form. When a definite, clear, vivid mental image is held in the mind with faith and directed toward this substance, the substance begins to organize itself around that image. The unseen begins to move toward the shape of what has been conceived. Faith is what holds the impression. Wattles is specific about this. Without faith, the thought cannot hold its shape long enough for the substance to receive it fully. Doubt dissolves the impression the way water dissolves an image drawn in sand at the shoreline. Faith is not confidence in one's own abilities. It is confidence in the nature of the substance itself, in its living responsiveness, its abundance, its desire to take the form that thought provides. Gratitude is the mechanism that keeps the thinker in relation to the source. This may sound peripheral, but Wattles treated it as essential. A mind that complains about lack, that dwells on what is absent, that resents what others have. That mind is orienting itself away from the source. Gratitude orients the mind towards supply. It is not a courtesy. It is a form of spiritual alignment that keeps the creative channel open between the thinker and the formless field. Action, finally, is what gives the form its physical path. The impressed substance organizes invisible forces and moves through unseen relations, but it must eventually arrive in the visible world through a physical channel. That channel is opened by action. The person who impresses substance and then refuses to act has formed something with no path into visibility. Wattles said the purpose of action is not to force visible wealth, but to give the moving substance a way to express itself in physical form. Action cooperates with the invisible process. It does not replace it. It would be easy to read Wattles' language about formless substance and conclude that he was teaching a version of wishful thinking, that if you simply imagine money, money will materialize. This misunderstanding has been so thoroughly attached to his work that it nearly buries what he actually said. Wattles was not teaching positive thinking. He was teaching creative causation, which is an altogether different thing. Positive thinking asks the mind to feel good about present circumstances. Creative causation asks the mind to become the origin of future circumstances. One is emotional management, the other is metaphysical function. Wattles wanted the reader to understand not that the mind influences mood, but that the mind impresses substance, and substance produces form. The difference is the difference between comfort and creation. His framework required the mind to relate to the formless substance as living, as responsive, and as inherently abundant. Not as a passive material that might or might not react to thought, but as a field that is already oriented toward creative expression, already permeated with the desire to take form, already containing an infinite supply from which any specific form can be drawn. To enter creative relation with this substance is to recognize its nature accurately, and accuracy for Wattles was the beginning of power. The competitive mind cannot enter this relation because competition presupposes scarcity. It assumes there is a fixed supply that must be taken from others. Wattles drew a sharp distinction between the competitive plane, where people fight over existing visible wealth, and the creative plane, where wealth is drawn from the formless supply that no competition can touch. These are not two strategies. They are two entirely different worlds, operating under different laws, producing different results. The person on the creative plane is not in competition with anyone because they are not drawing from a limited pool. They are drawing from the source itself. This is what makes Wattles' teaching genuinely unusual. He was not offering a technique for getting more from the existing visible world. He was describing a relation to an invisible creative field that lies behind the existing visible world, from which entirely new wealth, new channels, new forms, new supply can be drawn into existence. To enter that relation is not to be clever about visible resources. It is to leave the visible world behind as the origin point and go back to the cause. There is a temptation when encountering this teaching for the first time to treat it as permission. Permission to stop working. Permission to simply imagine the desired wealth and wait for it to materialize. This is perhaps the most persistent misreading of Wattles, and it deserves to be corrected directly, because it not only prevents results, but produces a specific kind of spiritual confusion. The confusion between creative law and magical passivity. The formless substance, as Wattles described it, is not an excuse for stillness. It does not bypass the requirement of action. Nothing in his framework suggests that the thinker can form a clear image of wealth, sit down, and wait for circumstances to arrange themselves without physical participation. The substance moves through channels. Channels require human action to open them. The law includes action as one of its essential components, not as a reluctant concession to physical reality, but as the necessary physical expression of the invisible creative process. The substance also does not obey scattered wishes. A person who today desires one kind of wealth, tomorrow desires another, and the next day abandons both for a third, has not impressed the substance with any definite form. Scattered desire creates scattered impression, and scattered impression creates nothing coherent. The substance cannot organize itself around a form that keeps dissolving. Definiteness is not optional. It is the quality of thought that makes the impression capable of holding. What Wattles taught is precise, a definite thought held with faith, expressed through grateful relation to source, and carried through action, impresses the living substance and produces visible wealth through channels. Remove the definiteness and the impression blurs. Remove the faith and the impression dissolves. Remove the gratitude and the relation to source breaks. Remove the action and the form has no physical path. Every element is load-bearing. The law does not simplify into a fantasy of effortless manifestation. It deepens into a discipline of inner precision. The title of this teaching speaks of an invisible power that creates all wealth. This is not a rhetorical device. In Wattles' cosmology, the invisible power is the formless substance in its creative function. The living, responsive, permeated with intelligence field that receives thought and produces form. It is invisible because it precedes physical expression. It is powerful because all physical wealth is its product. There is no visible wealth anywhere in the world that did not originate in this invisible creative process. The viewer commands this power not through ego, not through force, not through the kind of desperate mental pressure that fear produces. Command, in this context, means lawful relation. It means understanding the nature of the substance and relating to it correctly, through definiteness, through faith, through gratitude, through action. The law does not respond to demand or desperation. It responds to the correct quality of thought maintained in the correct inner position. The distinction between domination and command is important here. A person trying to force wealth through willpower alone, through anxious visualization, through frantic action divorced from creative relation, is not commanding the invisible. They are standing outside the creative field and shouting at it. True command is the quiet, certain, consistent act of impressing definite form upon a living substance that is already oriented toward creative expression. The confidence required is not arrogance. It is the calm recognition of how the law works. The invisible becomes visible through channels. This is the final point of this section, and it is the bridge between the metaphysical and the practical. The channels are the visible circumstances, opportunities, people, and events through which impressed substance moves as it takes physical form. The wealth does not appear from empty air. It arrives through organized visible pathways. But those pathways are not the origin, they are the expression of what was already organized in the invisible field. To understand this is to understand why two people in identical visible circumstances can produce radically different results. One is working only at the visible level, while the other is working at the level of cause. The living substance is the creative medium. It is not dead matter waiting passively to be acted upon by physical force. Wattles described it as permeated with life, with intelligence, with the inherent desire to move toward form. Think of it not as inert clay lying on a workbench, but as clay that is already reaching toward the potter's hands, already inclined toward expression, already oriented toward the shape that a clear mind can provide. The medium wants to take form. The only question is whether the thinker will provide a form worth taking. Thought is what gives it shape, not vague wishfulness, not general optimism, but definite, specific, vivid mental conception. Wattles used the word definite with great deliberateness. The image in the mind must be clear enough to be held, concrete enough to be felt, specific enough to be recognizable when it begins to emerge in visible form. A blurry desire impresses the substance like a blurry stamp. The edges are unclear, the form is indistinct, and what emerges from it bears little resemblance to what was intended. Faith is the force that keeps the impression from dissolving between the moment of conception and the moment of visible arrival. There is always a gap, the time between the clear mental impression and its first appearance in visible form is the most dangerous period, because the visible world offers no confirming evidence during that interval. Doubt enters the gap. It does not enter dramatically. It enters quietly, reasonably, dressed in practical language, and each time it enters, it softens the edge of the impression, blurs the form, and weakens the creative relation. Gratitude, held consistently, maintains the thinker's living connection to the source of supply. It is not gratitude for wealth that has not yet arrived exactly, though thankfulness for the expected good is part of it. It is more fundamentally an orientation of the whole mind toward the creative field, a recognition that the source is abundant, that supply is real, that the substance from which wealth forms is always present and always responsive. A mind dwelling in resentment, in complaint, in the chronic awareness of lack, has turned away from the source. Gratitude turns back toward it. Action is the physical expression of the creative process. When the invisible substance has been impressed with definite form, held in faith and maintained through grateful relation, it begins to organize the invisible forces and relations through which that form will emerge. But emergence into the visible world requires a physical pathway. The thinker must act as in their present place with what is at hand with full excellence to open the channel through which the organized substance can arrive. Action here is not desperate effort. It is the final physical step in a process that began far earlier, in the invisible. Wealth appears as organized substance through channels. This is the final fact of the mechanism. The money, the opportunity, the business, the abundance. These are forms of substance that has been organized by definite thought, held by faith, maintained by gratitude, and channeled by action. They arrive through visible pathways, but they originated in the invisible field. To see only the visible channel and miss the invisible origin is to misunderstand wealth at the most fundamental level, and to lose the ability to create it deliberately. The sequence begins with desire, not anxiety, not lack. Desire, the genuine, clear, inner sense that a specific form of wealth should exist in one's life. This desire, in Wattles's framework, is not a sign of greed or impracticality. It is the first creative impulse. It is the initial movement of the thinker's mind toward the substance. But desire alone is insufficient. Desire must become definite image before it can function as an impression. The definite image is the precise mental form of the desired wealth. Not, I want more money, but a clear, held, specific picture of what the wealth looks like, what it feels like to possess it, what it enables and expresses in life. This image must be formed and held with enough consistency that it becomes a reliable presence in the mind, something the thinker returns to daily, deliberately, with faith and gratitude, rather than a fleeting picture that appears and disappears with shifting emotion. When the definite image is impressed upon the living substance with faith and held with gratitude, the substance begins to move. Wattles describes this movement in terms of unseen relations, the invisible organizing of circumstances, people, and events in ways the physical mind cannot observe or predict. This is not supernatural intervention in the sense of miracles suspending natural law. It is the natural law of the invisible creative field doing what it has always done, organizing in response to impressed form. The mind of the thinker begins to receive direction. Ideas arrive. The attention is drawn toward particular actions, particular people, particular opportunities that the competitive mind, scanning only the visible world, would not have noticed. The creative mind, connected to the substance and oriented by its impression, begins to perceive selectively in the direction of the formed image. This is not imagination overriding reality. It is the mind, now aligned with the invisible process, beginning to see the channels that are opening. Action meets opportunity when the thinker moves on those received directions, when they follow the idea, speak to the person, take the step that presents itself. The opportunity is not created by the action in the conventional sense. The invisible organizing process has already placed the pieces. The action is the physical encounter between the thinker and what the substance has arranged. The meeting feels like luck to those who do not understand it. Wattles would say it is lawful response. The opportunity, entered faithfully and with excellence, becomes a channel. A channel is any visible pathway through which organized substance moves into the thinker's life as recognizable wealth. It might be a business relationship, a professional position, a creative project, a financial instrument, or any of the countless visible forms through which abundance flows. The channel is not the source, but it is the doorway through which the source delivers what has been formed in the invisible. Visible wealth arrives through the channel as organized substance. The process is complete. What began as desire has become definite image, became impression upon living substance, moved through unseen relations, directed the mind, met action, opened a channel, and arrived as wealth. This is the full invisible to visible sequence. Most people see only the final step, the visible arrival, and conclude that it came from visible causes. Wattles saw the whole sequence, from desire to delivery, and understood that the visible causes were themselves products of invisible organization. Vague desire is the first interruption, and it occurs before the mechanism even properly begins. The person who wants wealth but cannot hold a clear, specific mental image of what that wealth looks like has given the substance nothing definite to receive. The formless substance, by definition, requires form. It cannot organize around a blur. Vague desire impresses the substance the way fog presses against glass. It leaves no mark, no definition, no form. The process cannot advance without a definite beginning. Doubt after impression is perhaps the most devastating interruption because it occurs mid-process, after the thinker has already invested in the work of forming the image. Doubt does not announce itself as doubt. It announces itself as reason, as realism, as the responsible reconsideration of whether the desired wealth is truly possible. But in Wattles' framework, every moment of genuine doubt is an act of counter-impression, a new signal sent to the substance that conflicts with and partially dissolves the original form. The substance cannot hold a shape that the thinker is simultaneously withdrawing. Ungrateful attention to lack is the third interruption. When the mind turns its primary attention to what is absent, to how little is visible, to how far the current circumstances are from the desired wealth, it enters a state that cuts the creative relation. Gratitude is not merely pleasant feeling, it is the active orientation of the mind toward the source of supply. Ungrateful dwelling on lack is the active orientation away from it. The thinker cannot be connected to the supply they are refusing to acknowledge. Competitive fear enters when the mind begins to believe that wealth must be taken from others rather than drawn from source. The moment this belief governs the thinker has moved from the creative plane to the competitive plane. The methods change, the anxiety increases, the orientation shifts from abundance to scarcity, and the relation to the formless supply collapses. It cannot be maintained while the mind is simultaneously calculating who has what and who will be displaced. Refusal to act leaves the impressed form with no physical channel. The invisible organizing process can arrange all the pieces, but if the thinker does not move, if they wait for certainty before acting, if they defer the first physical step indefinitely, the channel never opens. The form organized in the invisible field finds no physical expression. Wealth, which requires a physical pathway for its visible arrival, cannot materialize through inaction. Constantly changing the desired form is the final major interruption. It is one of the most common and one of the hardest to recognize as destructive because it often feels like flexibility or growth. But each change of the desired form is a withdrawal of the previous impression and a new impression that must begin its invisible organizing process from the start. A mind that shifts its definite image weekly in response to fear or discouragement or the sight of what others seem to be getting creates nothing coherent. The substance cannot organize around a form that keeps being replaced before it has time to move toward visibility. To understand how the mechanism works, hold this image in mind. The living substance is like invisible clay, not cold hard clay, but warm, living, responsive material that fills all the space between visible things and runs through the invisible dimensions of the world. It is everywhere. It is always present. It has no shortage, and it is, by its very nature, ready to receive form. Thought is the mold pressed into this clay. When the mind holds a definite image with intention and faith, it is pressing a specific shape into the invisible material, leaving an impression in it the way a carved seal leaves its shape in warm wax. The impression must be clear. The sharper the seal, the more exact the form that emerges. A well-defined thought creates a well-defined impression. An undefined thought creates nothing recognizable. Faith holds the mold still while the clay sets. This is the essential function that faith performs in the mechanism. The impression does not become a finished form instantaneously. There is a period during which the substance is organizing around the shape provided, moving toward it, arranging itself into the form that will eventually emerge in the visible world. During this period, faith must hold the mold in place. A thinker who removes the mold halfway through, who doubts the impression before the form has solidified, disrupts the process at its most critical stage. Gratitude keeps the maker connected to the supply of clay. Imagine a sculptor working with this living material. If the sculptor becomes absorbed in complaint about how little clay they have been given, or how other sculptors seem to have more, or how the form they are creating seems too ambitious for the material available, the connection between maker and material weakens. Gratitude is the state in which the sculptor remains vividly aware that the supply of clay is unlimited, that more will always come from the same living source, and that the creative relation between maker and material is inherently abundant. Action places the formed image into the world. Once the mold has been pressed, once the clay has received the impression, once the invisible form has been organized, the thinker must physically move the created thing into visible space. The sculptor must open the door of the studio. They must carry the finished form out into the world where it can be seen and received. Action is not the creative act itself, but it is the act that makes the creation visible, that brings the organized invisible form across the threshold into physical reality. A shaking mold creates no clear form. Return to this image when the mechanism seems to be failing. The invisible clay is always present. The supply is always abundant. The creative law is always operating. If visible wealth is not appearing, the question is whether the mold is being held still. Doubt shakes it. Fear shakes it. Competitive thinking shakes it. Constant revision shakes it. The substance cannot set around a form that the thinker will not hold. Clarity, consistency, and the quiet certainty of faith are not virtues alongside the mechanism. They are the mechanism's essential operating conditions. The living clay wants to take form. It is oriented toward expression. The only question the creative law ever asks is whether the thinker will provide and hold a form clear enough for the substance to receive. There is an enemy inside the process that does not look like an enemy. It looks like wisdom. It looks like the careful, grounded, responsible recognition of what actually exists. It is the belief that only visible resources count, that only what can be seen, touched, verified, and measured in present reality constitutes genuine creative material. This belief is the most effective blocker of creative relation, precisely because it presents itself as the opposite of delusion. The person who carries this belief looks at their bank account, their job, their visible network, their measurable assets, and concludes that these constitute the full inventory of what they have to build with. They are not wrong that these things exist. They are wrong in the conclusion they draw from what they see, the conclusion that this visible inventory is the origin point of wealth, rather than the current state of an ongoing, invisible creative process. By treating visible resources as the only material, the person actively denies the invisible substance, not in a dramatic declaration, but in the ordinary daily practice of planning, worrying, deciding, and acting entirely within the boundaries of what is physically present. The invisible field remains untouched. The formless supply goes unaddressed. The creative medium through which wealth actually originates receives no impression, no faith, no gratitude, no action directed toward it. The person is trying to create wealth without ever touching the creative material. The belief in visible-only resources is particularly powerful because it speaks in the language of prerequisite. It presents itself not as a limitation, but as a requirement, as the reasonable precondition that must be satisfied before creative action can begin. Listen to the sentences it produces. I need money to make money. This is perhaps the most widely accepted financial statement in ordinary thinking, and it is the visible world belief in its purest expression. It places visible money as the origin of all further visible money, which means that those without it cannot begin. It cuts the invisible supply entirely out of the picture. It names the effect as its own cause and creates a closed loop from which escape seems impossible. I need contacts first. The assumption is that relationships, and therefore opportunities, must be assembled in the visible world before any creative movement can occur. This treats human connection as a visible resource to be collected, rather than as channels through which the already organized invisible process can move. The right people do not need to be collected in advance. They appear as the mechanism unfolds. I need the opportunity first. Here the prerequisite precedes the intention, which reverses the actual sequence of creative causation. In Wattles' framework, definite thought precedes visible opportunity. The opportunity is what appears as the substance organizes. Waiting for visible opportunity before forming definite thought is waiting for the effect to appear before initiating the cause. I need proof first. This is the voice of doubt dressed in scientific language. It asks for visible evidence that the mechanism works before committing faith to it, which means faith is never committed, because the visible evidence of an invisible process only appears after faith has been sustained long enough for the process to reach visible expression. Proof is always on the other side of faith, never before it. Each of these statements is a form of visible world worship, the elevation of visible material to the status of creator, which simultaneously demotes the invisible substance from its actual role as the creative origin of all wealth. The person who maintains visible world worship remains structurally competitive. They cannot help it. If visible resources are the only creative material, then anyone who has more of those resources has a permanent advantage, and the person with fewer is always in a weaker position, always chasing, always measuring their standing against the visible holdings of others. Competition is not a choice in this framework. It is the inevitable consequence of scarcity thinking. The feeling of poverty arrives before any actual poverty is confirmed. The mind trained to measure creative possibility by visible resources will feel poor the moment it looks at the numbers and finds them insufficient. This felt poverty is not a neutral observation. It is an active creative state. And in Wattles' law, a mind dwelling in the feeling of poverty impresses that feeling upon the substance as surely as a mind dwelling in the clear vision of wealth impresses that. The felt poverty creates the conditions for continued poverty, not because the universe is punishing the thinker, but because the impression being consistently sent to the substance is an impression of lack. New channels cannot be imagined by a mind locked in the visible-only world. The channel through which wealth arrives is always at first invisible. It exists as organized potential before it appears as recognizable opportunity. The mind that will only acknowledge what is already physically present cannot see these forming channels, cannot orient toward them, cannot prepare to meet them. It is looking for the doorway in a wall where the door has not yet appeared, and because it only trusts the visible, it concludes there is no door. The invisible power, which is the entire creative mechanism available to the thinker, remains unused. This is the full cost of the inner enemy, not the absence of a technique, not the lack of a strategy, but the complete disconnection from the only creative field that actually produces wealth. The visible resources this person so carefully counts and measures are the remnants of past creative processes, not the origin of new ones. And by treating them as origin, the person ensures that no new creative process begins. The first movement toward breaking this pattern is a recognition, not an action. The recognition that visible resources, the bank account, the connections, the opportunities in hand, are effects, not origins. They arrived through invisible creative processes that preceded them. Treating them as origin is like studying a shadow to understand the light. Begin with definite thought instead of with visible inventory. This is the practical reversal of the pattern. Rather than opening the morning with a measurement of visible resources, begin with the deliberate forming of the clear mental image of the wealth that is to come. This is not denial of the visible situation. It is the correct placement of cause before effect, the decision to work at the level of the creative origin rather than the level of the already completed result. Relation to substance is available immediately. It does not require visible resources as its precondition. The formless field is present right now, in whatever circumstances surround the thinker. The clay does not appear only after the sculptor has proven their skill in some other medium. The supply is already here. The relation is available the moment the thinker turns toward it with definiteness, faith, and gratitude. What lies ahead in this teaching is the point where understanding becomes application, where the intellectual recognition of the mechanism becomes a lived inner position that the thinker maintains deliberately, consistently, and regardless of what the visible world is showing. The turning point is not a dramatic external event. It is the quiet, firm decision to relocate the origin point of wealth from the visible to the invisible, and to hold that relocation with enough consistency for the creative law to do its work. The first thing that must stop is the sentence that begins with visible absence as its evidence. Wealth cannot come because the money is not there. Wealth cannot come because the opportunity has not appeared. Wealth cannot come because the visible circumstances do not support it. Every iteration of this sentence treats the present visible state as the creative authority, as the judge of what is and is not possible. And every time the mind accepts that sentence as final, it places a wall between itself and the invisible mechanism that creates what the visible world does not yet show. Competing mentally must also stop. This is harder to identify because it does not always feel like competition. It feels like awareness, an awareness of who has what, of who arrived first, of which positions are already occupied. But mental competition is the act of measuring creative possibility against the visible holdings of others, and every moment of it is a moment spent on the competitive plane rather than the creative plane. The creative substance is not diminished by what anyone else has drawn from it. There is no shortage in the formless field. Mental competition is a response to an imaginary scarcity. Desire must not be reduced to the dimensions of visible resources. The person who begins with a definite image of wealth and then immediately shrinks it to fit what the current visible situation seems to permit has undermined the creative process before it has properly started. Desire, in Wattles' framework, is the initial impulse that carries the impression into the substance. Diminished desire carries a diminished impression. The substance receives exactly what the thinker provides, no more and no less. The form must not be changed from fear, changing the definite image repeatedly, abandoning it when the visible world fails to confirm it quickly, replacing it with a smaller or safer version because the original felt presumptuous. These are all forms of mold shaking. The substance cannot organize around a form that the thinker withdraws under pressure. Consistency of form is the creative discipline. Fear is the force that destroys it. And what must stop most fundamentally is the act of commanding lack. Every time the mind dwells on the insufficiency of the visible situation, fixates on the distance between present and desired, or sends its sustained attention into the experience of not having, it is commanding lack. The creative law does not distinguish between intended and unintended impressions. It responds to what the mind holds with sustained attention and emotional energy. A mind that commands its attention toward absence will impress the substance with the form of absence. The invisible precedes visible wealth. This must be accepted not as philosophy, not as an interesting theory, but as the operative fact of how wealth comes into existence. Every visible abundance that has ever appeared in any human life was organized first in the invisible creative field, before money changed hands, before opportunity materialized, before circumstances aligned. The visible is always the arrival of what the invisible has already prepared. Accepting this changes where the thinker looks for creative authority. Definite thought has creative function, not persuasive function, not psychological function, not motivational function, creative function. The definite mental image is not simply a goal written on paper or an affirmation repeated for emotional support. In Wattles' framework, it is an act performed upon living substance. It is the press of the seal into the clay. The moment of definite, faith-held thought is a moment of actual creative causation. Accepting this means treating thought as work, as the primary creative labor, rather than as a preliminary step toward the real work of visible effort. Faith is required, not optional. This acceptance is perhaps the most demanding, because faith by definition precedes visible evidence. It asks the thinker to hold the impression with confidence during precisely the period when nothing visible confirms it. Accepting the requirement of faith means accepting that the mechanism will not provide visible proof before the faith is given. The sequence is faith first, then impression, then invisible organization, then visible arrival. Demanding visible proof before giving faith is asking the sequence to run backward. Gratitude connects. This acceptance is simpler in statement, but requires daily practice in expression. The grateful mind maintains its relation to the source. It turns toward supply rather than toward absence. It acknowledges the creative field as real, as abundant, as responsive, and as already working on behalf of the definite impression that has been given. Without gratitude, the connection to source weakens, and a weakened connection to source is a weakened impression upon the substance. Action cooperates with the invisible process. It does not initiate it. It does not replace it. It meets the process as it moves from the invisible toward the visible, and it opens the physical channel through which the organized substance arrives. Accepting this is accepting a different relationship to action, one in which effort is offered with confidence and presence rather than with panic and force, because the thinker understands that the action is the final step of a creative process already well underway. I command the invisible through definite thought. This is not a comfort phrase. It is a statement of the thinker's actual creative relation to the formless substance. To take this as one's inner position is to accept full creative responsibility. Responsibility not for forcing visible circumstances, but for maintaining the quality of thought, faith, and gratitude that impresses the substance correctly. Command here is not aggression. It is the calm, consistent exercise of creative authority by a mind that understands the law and relates to the substance as it actually is. The visible is not the source. Holding this position does not require denying the visible world or pretending the current circumstances are other than they are. It requires a simple, firm refusal to grant the visible world creative authority over what can be formed from the invisible. The bank account is a report on past creative processes. The present visible circumstances are the arrived effects of previously held impressions. They describe where the creative process has brought the thinker so far. They do not determine where the creative process will bring them next. Substance receives the form I hold. This is the thinker's recognition of their actual creative role. The substance is always present. The supply is always available. The creative field is always responsive. What determines the form that emerges from it is the form the thinker holds with faith and sustains with gratitude. The responsibility is not to push visible circumstances into new shapes. The responsibility is to hold the inner impression with enough consistency and clarity that the substance can receive it and begin its organizing work. I act as the channel opens. Action in the new inner position is not forced, it is responsive. The channel is opened by the invisible organizing process as it moves toward visible expression. The thinker acts when they perceive the direction in which the substance is moving. When the idea comes, when the person appears, when the opportunity presents itself. Action from this position has a different quality than desperate effort. It is confident, present, and aligned with a creative process the thinker trusts because they understand it. There are only two choices available at this point in the understanding, and they cannot be held simultaneously. The first choice is visible limitation, the decision to treat the current bank account, the current visible opportunities, and the current measurable resources as the creative authority over what wealth can and cannot be built. This choice is always available, and it will always feel like the factual choice, the grounded choice, the responsible choice. The second choice is invisible causation, the decision to treat the formless living substance as the creative origin of wealth and to work primarily at the level of definite thought, faith, gratitude, and cooperative action. This choice feels demanding because it requires accepting as real something that produces no visible evidence in its early stages. It asks for faith before confirmation, for creative commitment before creative result, for a sustained inner discipline maintained through the gap between invisible impression and visible arrival. Visible limitation feels factual because it is built from measurable things. The numbers are real. The limited visible opportunities are real. The competitive field is real. What invisible causation requires is not the denial of these realities, but the refusal to grant them the status of creative origin. They are real as effects. They are not real as causes. The decision point is the moment the thinker chooses which of these two positions will govern their inner world going forward. Creative relation cannot be half-held. The mind either relates to the invisible substance as the creative origin of wealth, or it does not. It either impresses definite form with faith and gratitude, or it scatters its creative energy across visible limitations and competitive measurements. The decision is not made once. It is made in every moment when visible limitation speaks, and the thinker chooses whether to accept it as final or to hold the impression and continue. Choosing creative relation again and again in exactly those moments, that is the turning point. Before the numbers, before the scan of the bank account, before the measure of what has arrived and what has not, before the morning calculus of visible resource, hold the prior thing first. Remember that the substance exists. Remember that the formless creative field is not diminished by what the account shows, because the account is an effect and the substance is the cause. Begin from the cause. Let the visible numbers be read, when they must be read without granting them creative authority over what comes next. Form the desired image clearly before the day begins to fill with the noise of visible concern. This is not a lengthy exercise. It is a deliberate, specific act, holding the mental picture of the wealth to be drawn from the substance with the clarity and confidence of someone who has already understood the mechanism. The image should be specific enough to be recognized when it arrives. Hold it with faith, not performance of faith, not the effort of convincing oneself, but the quiet, firm recognition that the creative law is operating, that the impression has been sent, and that the substance is already responding. Hold the image without panic when the visible world shows evidence of its absence. The visible world will show this evidence. It almost always does. In the early stages of any creative process, the account will not immediately change, the opportunity will not immediately arrive, the channel will not immediately become visible. This is not disconfirmation. This is the normal interval between impression and visible arrival, during which the invisible organizing process is doing its work without any visible report of its progress. Panic during this interval is the shaking mold. See the current visible resources accurately, not as the source of wealth, but as channels. Whatever money is presently available, whatever contacts exist, whatever skills and opportunities are currently in hand, these are channels that the substance has already organized and delivered. They are not the origin of new wealth, but they are present tools through which action can be taken right now. Moving from creative relation means using the present channels with excellence, while remaining aware that new channels are forming in the invisible field, shaped by the impression already given. Every movement the thinker makes from within this perception, planning, deciding, acting, observing, carries a different quality than movement made from within visible limitation. The orientation is toward creation rather than competition, toward the invisible source rather than the visible inventory. This daily shift in perception is not a morning ritual performed and forgotten. It is the sustained repositioning of the mind's creative gravity from the visible effect to the invisible cause. When the habitual thought arrives, "I have nothing to build with," receive it without acceptance. Hear it, recognize it as the visible world reflex, and replace it with the accurate statement of the law. The invisible substance is the creative material, and it is always present, always abundant, and already receiving the definite form I am holding. This replacement is not self-deception. It is a correction of the thought from an inaccurate premise to an accurate one. The substance is genuinely present. The supply is genuinely unlimited. The corrected thought is not optimistic fiction. It is the more accurate description of how wealth originates. Replace "money must come from money" with the longer truth that Wattles taught. Wealth comes from formed substance moving through channels. The channels include money, yes, but they also include ideas that have never been monetized before, relationships that have never been activated, skills that have never been applied to their highest use, opportunities that have not yet become visible, because the invisible organizing process has not yet brought them to the surface. The channel can take countless forms. The source is always the same formless substance, always responding to the same creative law. Keep the form definite as a matter of daily practice. Do not allow the mental image of desired wealth to blur into general feeling. General's feelings of wanting to be better off do not impress the substance with sufficient precision. The image must be specific enough to be held, vivid enough to carry emotional weight, clear enough to be recognizable when it begins to arrive. Return to the definite image daily, not with the anxiety of someone checking whether their wish has been granted, but with the confidence of someone maintaining the mold while the clay sets. The thought discipline required here is not exhausting when it is correctly understood. It is not the effort of mental suppression, of forcing away unwanted thoughts by brute will. It is the simpler, more sustainable practice of returning again and again to the most accurate available description of how wealth forms, and letting that accurate understanding reshape the thought patterns over time. A mind that has genuinely accepted the law of living substance does not need to fight against visible limitation thoughts with great effort. It simply recognizes them as inaccurate and moves back to the impression. Do not treat thought discipline as performance. The substance does not respond to performed faith or rehearsed affirmation. It responds to the genuine inner position of a mind that has understood the mechanism, accepted the law, and is actually relating to the formless field as the creative origin of the wealth it is forming. The difference between genuine inner relation and performed affirmation is the difference between pressing a clear seal into warm clay and pressing a cloth against a wall. Act in the present place. This is one of Wattles's most direct instructions, and it is exactly as simple as it sounds. The channel through which the next visible wealth will arrive has not yet opened fully. What is present right now is the current place, the current position, the current role, the current available action. The thinker who waits for the large opportunity before giving full attention and full excellence to the present opportunity will never arrive at the large one, because the large one often arrives through channels created by the quality of the present one. Do what is at hand with excellence. The word Wattles used was efficient, acting with full power in the present action, giving more in use value than is received in cash value, doing each thing with the fullest possible quality of attention and care. This is not instruction in perfectionism. It is instruction in creative expression. The thinker who is genuinely in creative relation to the formless substance will naturally act from a different source than the thinker operating from visible limitation fear. Excellence is the natural outflow of the creative state. Do not compete from fear. This is the distinction between efficient action and desperate action. Desperate action is driven by competitive fear, by the belief that if this particular visible channel does not yield, there is nothing else. Creative action is driven by the understanding that channels are opened by the invisible organizing process, that more than one can be forming simultaneously, that the substance is not limited to a single pathway through which wealth can arrive. Acting from this understanding produces a visible difference in the quality and direction of the action itself. Let the action express the impressed form. The thinker who has held a definite mental image of a specific kind of wealth will find, when acting in the present place with full excellence, that their actions naturally carry the direction of the impression. The ideas that come during action will carry the shape of the formed image. The opportunities noticed will tend toward the direction of the impression. This is not coincidence. The mind aligned with the invisible creative process is oriented to perceive and respond to the channels that the process is opening. Watch for channels without forcing them. The channel through which the next visible wealth arrives may not look like what the thinker expected. It may come through an unexpected person, an unpredictable circumstance, a seemingly unrelated opportunity. Watching without forcing means maintaining an open, alert orientation to the directions in which the substance is organizing, rather than insisting that the channel must look exactly as it was imagined. The form is definite. The channel through which it arrives may be surprisingly various. Doubt arrives most reliably when visible lack becomes visible. When the account drops, when the expected opportunity fails to materialize, when the channel that seemed to be opening closes instead, the impression weakens. The visible evidence of absence presses against the held form and begins to shake the mold. This is the moment most people abandon the creative process and return to the visible limitation mind. And it is precisely the moment that determines whether the invisible organizing process will reach visible expression. When visible lack appears, the instruction is precise. Do not let it erase the form. The lack is visible. The form is invisible. The lack is the current state of a visible effect. The form is the operative instruction being held in the invisible creative field. They are not the same category of fact. Visible lack describes where the creative process has arrived so far. The invisible form describes where the creative process is going. Letting visible lack erase the form is letting the effect undo the cause. Return to definite thought as the first act of restoration. Not with the anxious urgency of someone who fears the whole process has failed, but with the quiet, deliberate repressing of the seal into the clay. The image was held before. Hold it again. The substance received it before. It will receive it again. The creative relation is available in this moment, just as completely as it was in the first moment of impression. The fact that the visible world is showing lack does not close the invisible field. Re-enter gratitude immediately after returning to the definite thought. Gratitude is the fastest path back to creative relation because it turns the attention from the visible absence toward the invisible supply. It does not deny the visible situation, but it places the attention on the source rather than on the current report from the effect. A genuine moment of gratitude for the substance itself, for its abundance, its responsiveness, its living creative nature, reconnects the thinker to the field from which the form will emerge. Take one faithful action. Do not wait until the doubt has fully passed, because it may not pass before action is needed. Choose the clearest available present action that aligns with the impressed form, and take it in the spirit of cooperative confidence. The action reinforces the creative position. It is a physical declaration that the thinker has not retreated into visible limitation thinking, and it keeps the channel open. Consider a person who has little visible money, no prominent connections, no access to the capital that conventional financial thinking says must precede the building of wealth. By all visible measures, they are exactly the profile that the visible limitation belief declares incapable of creative advance. They know what they want. The image is specific. It lives in their mind with a clarity they have cultivated deliberately. And they have made a choice. They will not treat the visible situation as creative authority over what this image can become. Rather than beginning each day by measuring the gap between the empty account and the desired wealth, they begin by holding the image. They relate to the invisible substance as the field from which the desired form will be drawn. The account number is received as information about the current state of visible channels, not as a judgment on the creative possibility ahead. This shift in morning orientation does not change the account number, but it changes the quality of mind entering the day, and the quality of mind changes everything that follows. Days pass. The visible situation does not change dramatically, but something subtler is happening. An idea arrives that connects two previously unrelated pieces of what the thinker already has. A conversation with someone they already knew opens in an unexpected direction. An opportunity presents itself that would have been invisible to the mind locked in competitive scarcity, but that this mind, oriented creatively, recognizes immediately as a channel. They act on it, not frantically, but with the full excellence of someone whose creative relation is intact. Wealth begins, not as a sudden flood of visible money, but as organized substance arriving through a channel that the invisible process had been constructing all along. The definite image, held with faith and gratitude and expressed through present action, has done exactly what the law promised it would do. The visible wealth that arrives is not luck. It is the visible expression of an invisible order that has been in process since the first moment the form was impressed upon the living substance. Wealth always begins this way, invisible first, organized in the unseen, channeled through action, arriving in visible form as the natural completion of a creative process that started long before any money changed hands. The law, stripped to its essential sequence, is this: wealth begins in invisible substance. Before the money, before the opportunity, before the visible channel through which abundance arrives, there is a formless, living, responsive field that permeates the universe and waits to receive the definite forms that human thought provides. This is not metaphor. It is Wattles' statement of the actual creative sequence by which all visible wealth has ever come into existence. The invisible is always first. Thought impresses the substance with the specific form of what is desired. Not general feeling, not vague aspiration, but the clear-held, vivid mental image of a specific form of wealth, pressed into the living creative field with the confidence of someone who has understood how the mechanism works. This impression is the originating creative act. Everything that follows in the sequence, the invisible organizing, the channel opening, the visible arrival, proceeds from this first act of definite mental formation. Faith holds the impression long enough for the substance to receive it fully and begin its organizing response. The gap between impression and visible arrival is the interval during which faith is the thinker's only operative tool. Nothing visible confirms the process during this interval. The substance is organizing in the unseen dimensions, moving toward the formed image, preparing the channels that will carry it into visibility. Faith holds the form steady while this invisible work proceeds. Action channels the organized substance from the invisible into the visible world. When the creative process has been correctly initiated and faithfully maintained, action is not the desperate effort of someone trying to force results. It is the confident physical expression of an invisible process already well advanced. The person acts in the present place with excellence, watches for the opening channel, and moves into it when it appears, carrying the organized form of the desired wealth across the threshold from invisible to visible. In the old life, visible resources were the source, the bank account, the contacts, the measurable opportunities in hand. These were treated as the origin of all possible wealth. Wealth could only come from wealth. Opportunity could only come from opportunity. The visible world was the whole creative field, and when it showed scarcity, scarcity was what the creative life contained. The mind operated exclusively at the level of effect, trying to generate new effects from old effects, without ever touching the cause. In the new life, the invisible substance is the creative field. The bank account is a report, not an origin. The current visible situation is the arrived product of past creative processes, not the judge of future creative possibility. The formless supply from which new wealth can be drawn is always present, always abundant, always responsive to the definite impressions provided by a mind that understands the law. Wealth can come from what is not yet visible, because visible wealth is always preceded by invisible creative organization. The old mind competed. It calculated its position against the visible holdings of others, measured every opportunity as a limited prize that might be taken before it could be claimed, and approached the field of wealth as a battlefield in which scarcity was the permanent condition. Competitive thinking cut the creative relation, shrank desire, and produced exactly the results that scarcity consciousness produces, a world that appeared to confirm the original belief that there was not enough. The new mind creates. It draws from the formless supply, not from the visible holdings of others. Its desire does not diminish in the presence of what others have, because it understands that the invisible source is inexhaustible and that another person's drawn wealth does not reduce the available supply by any measure. The new mind forms definite images, holds them with faith, maintains gratitude toward the source, and acts with the confidence of someone who has placed their creative authority in the invisible field where creative authority actually resides. Here is the final thing to understand about the invisible. It is not empty. The word invisible does not mean absent, does not mean uncertain, does not mean hypothetical. The invisible substance that Wattles described is the fullest thing that exists. The living, intelligent, permeated with creative desire field from which every visible thing has been organized and drawn. What appears empty to the eye that looks for visible matter is, in Wattles' vision, the most creatively dense environment available to the human mind. The apparent emptiness is the unformed supply. It is not nothing. It is everything that has not yet been given form. It is the living material of all visible wealth. Every business that has created prosperity, every structure that has sheltered abundance, every channel through which money has flowed into a human life, all of it was drawn from this invisible creative field. This is not a spiritual comfort designed for those who have little. It is the actual sequence by which every form of visible wealth that has ever existed came into being. The invisible precedes the visible. The formless precedes the formed. The cause precedes the effect, and the cause is always and only available in the invisible creative field. Command it lawfully, through definite thought. This is the full instruction, stated finally in its simplest form. Command does not mean domination. It does not mean the frantic pressure of a desperate mind trying to force the universe to comply. It means the calm, clear, consistent exercise of creative authority by a mind that has understood the law, accepted the substance as real, and taken up the discipline of forming definite images, holding them with faith, maintaining gratitude toward the source, and acting with cooperative excellence in the present place. That is the whole of the certain way. That is the secret of the living substance. You now hold what Wattles gave, the understanding that the visible is an effect, that the invisible is the creative origin, and that the definite thought held with faith and expressed through grateful action is the mechanism by which all wealth is formed. This understanding is not passive knowledge. It asks to be taken as an active inner position, held against the pressure of visible limitation, maintained through the interval between impression and arrival, and expressed in every present action as the confidence of someone who knows where creative authority actually lives. There is a declaration that belongs to a person who has accepted this, not a declaration of what they hope for, not a declaration of what they plan to wish, but a statement of their actual creative relation to the invisible field from which visible wealth is drawn. If you have followed this teaching with your full attention, that declaration is already forming in you. Speak it now clearly, as a statement of who you are in relation to the living substance that creates all wealth. The declaration is this: I command the invisible through definite thought. Write it in the comments below, not as a ritual phrase, but as the statement of a creative position you have chosen. You are a thinker who impresses living substance with definite form. You are a person who holds faith during the invisible interval. You are someone who acts in the present place as the channel opens, who maintains gratitude toward the source, who refuses to grant visible limitation the authority it claims over the invisible creative field from which your wealth is being formed right now. I command the invisible through definite thought. Say it with the understanding of what it means. It means that the formless field receives the form you provide. It means that you are working at the level of cause, not the level of effect. It means that the visible world, the numbers, the narrow opportunities, the competitive field, is not the final word on what your creative process will produce. The invisible substance is already in motion around the form you have impressed. The law is already operating. I command the invisible through definite thought. This is your identity in the creative process Wattles described. Hold it as such. Return to it every morning before the visible measurements begin. Return to it every evening when the visible day is complete. Return to it in the interval between impression and arrival, when the invisible is still working and the visible has not yet confirmed it. Command the invisible through the disciplined, faithful, grateful precision of definite thought, and watch the visible world organize itself around what you have formed. If this teaching has opened something in your understanding of how wealth actually originates, there is more. This channel is devoted to the full depth of what Wallace Wattles taught, the nature of formless substance, the law of creative causation, the certain way of action, the role of gratitude in maintaining supply, and the complete system by which definite thought becomes visible wealth. Subscribe and remain in contact with these teachings as they unfold. The work of Wattles is not exhausted in a single teaching. The layers of the science of getting rich, the understanding of the thinking stuff that permeates all things, the discipline of working on the creative plane rather than the competitive, these are subjects that reward continued attention. Stay close to this channel if your desire is to go deeper into the invisible mechanism that governs visible wealth. From this day, stop worshipping the visible material as the origin of your wealth. Stop opening the morning with the measurement of visible limitation. Stop treating the account balance, the narrow opportunity, the absent contact as the creative authority over what your life can produce. The visible is an effect. Treat it accurately, as a report on past creative processes, and nothing more. Your creative authority does not live there. Hold the definite form instead. Hold it with the faith that keeps the mold still. Hold it with the gratitude that keeps the creative relation to source alive. Act in the present place with the excellence of someone whose creative process is already underway in dimensions the eye cannot see. Watch for the channel without forcing it. Move into it when it appears. And do not let visible limitation speak the final word over the invisible process that is already, right now, organizing itself around the form you have given it. The invisible is not empty. It is not distant. It is not reserved for those who already have visible wealth and therefore need it least. The invisible is the beginning of all wealth, every form of it, in every human life, in every era, under every circumstance. The living substance has always been present. The creative law has always been operating. The only thing that has ever stood between any thinker and the wealth drawn from the invisible field is the belief that the visible world is the only material. That belief ends here.